So the claim I'm responding to today is Krithika's claim that arming teachers in order to protect students in a school shooting would do more harm than good. She had 3 secondary claims, and her first one was that arming civilians will make it harder to identify who the real shooter is, resulting in law enforcement being confused or accidentally targeting the wrong person. Her second point is that having a gun in the classroom would actually increase the chances of a school shooting. And her third point is that teachers having guns would cause many problems and provide little help. My response to Krithika's claim today is that Krithika failed to prove that arming teachers in order to protect students in a school shooting would do more harm than good. Going back to her first point, that arming teachers will make it harder for law enforcement to identify who the shooter is versus who the victims are. She uses 2 examples to support this claim, a quote and a real-life example. Her example that she uses is of Joe Zamudio, who almost shot a civilian when he saw that they had a gun. Some background information on this incident was that it was from 2011, so quite a while ago, and the shooting was at a drugstore. Basically, Zamudio was around the corner from a drugstore when he heard the drugstore being robbed, and he happened to have his gun on him, and he ran to help. Zamudio is a civilian and not an officer who is not trained to use his gun in situations like these. The speaker uses this as an example to help her argument about school shootings, when this took place in a drugstore, not at a school. Zamudio is also, like I said, not a trained officer, so of course he's more likely to mistake the shooter with the victim. Officers that are called onto school campuses for school shootings are trained to use their gun and to use it under pressure like situations like those. Moving on to her second claim, that having a gun in the classroom would increase chances of a school shooting, when in reality, teachers in most states are already allowed to have a gun on campus with restrictions, of course. These guns are not carried on the teachers, but usually in a safe place within their classroom that the students cannot get a hold of. Just the fact that these teachers have a gun or are able to have access to a gun within their classroom has not actually increased the chances of a school shooting within that school or their district. In an article done by CNN in 2018, it says that for more than 15 years, Utah educators have been able to bring their guns to schools, and the state's concealed weapons law allows any person with a permit to have a concealed weapon on campus. From the same article, the Mountain View School District, which is in Boise, has allowed staff members to carry concealed weapons on campus for the last year. So whether it's been the last 15 years or the last year, teachers having access to their guns on campus has not increased the amount of school shootings that have occurred on their school campus. Moving on to her third secondary claim, that teachers having guns would cause many problems and provide little help. Well, actually, with response times from law enforcement varying through different schools and different school districts, and some kids actually feeling safer knowing that their teachers have guns, arming teachers could provide more than just little help. Let's think about why schools would even have to resort to arming teachers in the first place. Like I said before, law enforcement could take an hour or even more to get to schools depending on where you live. An article done by the Not Fake News in 2018 said that over 40% of schools hired an armed police officer as school shootings started to increase. These police officers would basically stay at the school and be stationed there all day long, every single day of the school year, and they would be paid by the schools, just in case anything happened. But many schools cannot afford this. Like I said, with response times from law enforcement averaging from an hour or even more for some schools, every minute counts in a situation like this. From the same article from CNN, it says that Clarksville School District in Arkansas has been arming teachers for 4 years. For them, hiring one school district officer would cost them $50,000 a year. But when they started this training of staff members, it costed them $68,000 to train 13 staff members when the program began. So although this is $18,000 more than hiring the police officer, it still is 12 more bodies as opposed to the one police officer that can help under an attack, and would be more beneficial than just that one person. Going along with this, students in the Kalispell Independent School District in Texas say that they feel safer knowing that their teachers can protect them if the unthinkable happens. To conclude, Krithika failed to prove that arming teachers to protect students from school shootings would do more harm than good. Because like I said before, every minute counts in a situation like this, and doing something is better than waiting.
All right, structurally everything is easy to follow. You outline what the advocate's claims were pretty clearly at the beginning. Your general proposition in response, which you don't necessarily need to have, but yours was clearly stated that they simply failed to prove that there is going to be more harm as a consequence of this. On the first point, I thought that you did a good job going after the example that the advocate had. There's a challenge to its relevance because it happened in a different circumstance. There's a challenge about timing kinds of issues. I think there's probably some other issues that would come up, especially in the circumstances of a school being substantially different. It's unlikely that a teacher would mistake a student, for instance, with a gun as a student who's not a shooter, or, for example, that the police officers would mistake a teacher for a shooter. I think there's some argument to be made there, but I thought that the challenge that you had on their evidence was pretty solid. On the second point, you actually had some interesting information suggesting that a number of schools already allow this, and there hasn't really been an increased chance or risk in any of those places. The absence of examples in the school districts that you point to, I think that's a pretty good starting point on this issue to convince us that there isn't necessarily any risk that's involved there. I didn't really hear any discussion of what the advocate's evidence on this particular point was, and so this is mostly relying on a counterclaim argument, but it's a well-developed one, and it's very applicable in the way this subject was being developed in the first place. On the third point, you do kind of suggest that there is a situation where we have to make a choice, and the question concerns whether or not the choice that we're making is better than another choice that we could be making, and you suggest that the choice of waiting, hoping for the best, and relying on law enforcement is not really reasonable. Now, you have this estimate about an hour response time. That seems a little high, but I didn't hear any evidence on that, so that seems problematic to me. I think you'd probably need to have some information on that. If the response time of the police to a school shooter is going to be an hour, that seems, maybe in Fairbanks, Alaska, if the police are on, 100 miles away, but that seems like a long time. So I'm just not sure where that information came from. That's a little bit problematic. The argument, for instance, that says that a lot of school districts hired police officers or armed guards to be on campus, I think that's a good point. It would be interesting to know if that has been successful at discouraging school shooters, or if we had a reduction in the number of schools that are attacked that do have armed guards on the campus. Of course, you're talking about the notion of teachers being able to do this. You suggested that the teachers keep the guns in a safe place, but later on you mentioned that in Utah, for instance, that actually not later on, earlier, that teachers can have concealed carry on the second point wherever they go. So I guess out on the playground when they're supervising the kids at lunchtime, as long as they got the gun in their pocket, it's okay. That, I think, is an interesting issue. The idea that it might be an effective deterrent doesn't really get discussed very much. The training cost issue is, it's an okay press on this, the notion that it would be actually less expensive to allow teachers to be trained so that they could carry guns on campus rather than having the police officers that you have to pay to do that. And of course, let's go back to the notion that they're not doing the same kinds of things. They're only responding in an emergency situation or circumstance. I think that that's an opportunity that you missed to distinguish the claim that was being presented there. And again, I like the example that you finish off with the kids in the Texas school feeling safer as a consequence of their teachers being able to defend them. I think that's an important important point that talks about why these problems need to be looked at the way they are. All right, thank you.